they analyzed it like it was very probabilistic with the way that they thought about things, like
doing interesting things and asking interesting questions.
Do you happen to remember that question?
I do. I don't think I'm ever going to forget it.
You don't want to solely rely on evidence. You don't want to solely rely on your prior beliefs. You kind of have to have like a mix of both, if that makes sense. Besides all of that,
then it comes out that gold is worth nothing, but we still use the same, I don't know, it's a terrible analogy, but like the same bartering rules and approach. Like, it just
wanting to model for other people what I've been preaching my whole career. In order to make progress, you have to sort of reach across the aisle and be that kind of person.
Yeah, I mean, expected points added is a better version of yards per play, and they were realizing that these yards weren't being treated equally. And
all right, welcome everybody. Very excited for what we got going on here. I talked to Colin maybe a month or two ago, and I said, hey, you know, the new group for the Commanders is going to be heavily analytics driven, and I know nothing about analytics. Can we put together maybe a little mini series to try to get some of us that don't know as much to know a little bit more? So we've put together, I think, a 6-part docu-series type thing here. Colin, why don't you tell us a little bit about what we're looking forward to with this project and who we've got today?
Thank you, Doug. Really appreciate the invite. Calling this little series, Pardon My Math, talk about, these new analytics and maybe, make some friends along the way. I couldn't think of a better person to start that with than Tej Seth. My brief disclaimer is, again, I'm not a data scientist, just hoping to learn a lot more about this today. And so, Tej.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm doing great, and thanks for having me on. I appreciate the kind words, and I'm really excited to be a part of this docuseries. And I'm lucky to be included with all the people that you've organized for this. I think it's going to be really fun, and I think it's a great, exciting time to be a fan of the Commanders right now with all the push that they're doing towards analytics. So hopefully, we can provide some insight on what that'll look like for Washington going forward.
Tej, how did you get started with the data science stuff?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so when I was in high school, I'd always really liked sports. My best subject in school was math. I wasn't that good at English or history or anything like that. And so when I eventually got to college, I joined this club called the Michigan Football Analytics Society. And this is where I started to learn about advanced metrics in football. I learned about what expected points added as EPA, like we'll talk about today, or completion percentage over expected. And I still didn't know how to code at the time, but it was starting to kind of build up for me as I was interested in this stuff more than I was before. And that's really what led me to learning how to code myself. I used some tutorials I found online and learned how to program in different coding languages, and to be able to do data analysis with football data, because that's really what I enjoyed doing. And, started posting on Twitter and, became friends with Colin because of that. And it really went from there, which was really exciting.
All right, Colin, let's get us started here.
So we're going to talk a lot about Virgil Carter today, who is one of the creators of expected points added. But I saw this video that you did like 6 years ago with stuff that John Bois did. And can you tell us about Max McGee and why you chose to tell that story?
Yeah, that was I think that was either my junior or senior year of high school. And we had to do some type of video project that involved data. And I had stumbled across the Max McGee story just reading through random articles, the week of the Super Bowl, because really with the Max McGee story, he went out the night before the Super Bowl because he didn't think he was going to play. He was an older player, coming towards the end of his career, and he didn't sleep the night before the Super Bowl. He thought he was just going to stand on the sidelines the whole time. And what ended up happening was they had a crazy amount of injuries at wide receiver during the Super Bowl. I think this was Super Bowl 2 or 3, maybe, for the Packers. And he ended up having to go into the game. And even though, he was sleep deprived, he was hungover, he ended up having this really, really good statistical performance in that game. And something that, a lot of wide receivers that have, gotten their fair share of sleep the night before the Super Bowl haven't come close to, especially when you consider the passing era that we're in now compared to what it was back then. So, it was a fun story to tell. And, John was really helpful when I reached out to him in email and asked him how he did his Google Earth images and was able to put data onto the actual like earth layout and move around. And, he sent me a whole list of things that I could do with that. So I really appreciated his help. And it was nice to see him show that side of his mentorship there with helping me do that project.
Yeah, I thought that was so cool because, you have all this data that you're finding at that time. It was available for you and you used it to tell the story. That was very unique. Have you kept in touch with John?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, again, like when we talk about inspirations, like he was one of my bigger inspirations for getting into sports analytics. So we've DM'd on Twitter, usually a couple times a year and just kind of share how things are going. And, he's really busy with a lot of the stuff he's doing at Secret Base with those YouTube videos and articles. But, it's always very humbling to be able to talk to someone that like inspired me to do a lot of this stuff.
Shifting now to a graphic that I love you guys put out from Sumersports. And this one is from the last game, where Washington played Dallas. For those that are listening at home and don't have access to this video that we're showing, it has 3 columns. It has Washington Cowboys, and so the score is 10-45. But the first row you have is EPA per play. Can you tell us a bit about EPA per play and how you involve that in your fandom?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And, I'm glad that we're bringing this up. I know it might be a little bit of a tougher game to talk about from a Washington standpoint, but yeah, I mean, expected points added is a better version of yards per play. And, we often see yards cited in so many different pregame and postgame reports. Why analytics people like myself prefer expected points added, or also known as EPA, is because it doesn't treat all yards the same. When you gain 3 yards on 3rd and 1, that does increase your chance of scoring because you got the first down. You have, 4 new downs to continue to get closer. But when you gain 3 yards on 3rd and 20, you're sitting there at 4th and 17, and you're most likely punting or kicking a field goal. That doesn't really increase your chance of scoring. So that's why there's some empty yards that can be accounted for in EPA, and that's what gets taken into account when we look at this metric. So when we look at the difference between your expected points from the previous play to where you currently are, that's what your expected points added is on that play. So when you see here that Dallas had positive 0.40 expected points added per play, that meant on each play of the game, they were on average increasing their chance of scoring by 0.4 points. So if you're sitting there at 2.6 expected points, and then you have a play that ends up setting up a chip shot field goal that has like a 99% chance of it that's a 3 expected points. So that's where your 0.4 expected points added comes from on that play.
And is there an average that we're trying to get to, Tej? How do we use this to know where we're headed and how we can be better?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the average for expected points added is 0. So if that if you're above that, you're an above average offense. If you're below that, you're a below average offense.
And do we prefer the EPA to the success rate? How do we use them together? Because I see here at the bottom that the success rate is the percentage of plays when the EPA is 0, which you've said is the number that we base it off of. How do we use the success rate in harmony with EPA?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's another great thing to bring up. And they should be used together when you're evaluating a team's performance, because when you look at success rate, it tries to take out a lot of things that are noisy about a football game. So when you have a pick 6 happen, like the one that happened in this game between the Commanders and Cowboys, the EPA on that play is going to be like -8 or -9 and really be detrimental to that advanced metric. But the success rate would just be 0 for that play. Whereas if that pass was completed, it would have been 1. And that's the only type of outcomes you can have. It's a very binary scale. So when you look at the Commanders in this game, 63rd percentile success rate on a down-to-down basis, they were moving the ball fine. But when you include the negatives that happened, the pick 6 and the sacks that were taken, I think there was even a fumble, if I remember right, like that's where the EPA starts to become 13th percentile because of that.
Do you want to say about some of these other stats that you have here? You've already briefly talked about negative play rate, or alluded to it, I think, maybe like the importance of it.
Yeah. I mean, that's something really good to bring up. Like when you look at the Commanders having like a 15% negative play rate in this game, that's where you can explain the gap between their success rate percentile and their EPA success percentile, where it's just like you saw the difference between, there are some plays that aren't successful, but those plays being an incomplete pass versus a sack like can mean a lot for your EPA because sacks will lose more EPA. And then you look on the Cowboys side of the ball, and they had a really high explosive play rate in this game. So even though they were really successful on a down-to-down basis, they had an even higher EPA because they were having so many 20, 30-yard passes that were able to generate these explosive plays for them. That was really bumping up the EPA.
Is there a number on this list that is more important than another number? Is there a number that we're using more now than we haven't been previously?
Yeah. So in general, like the team with the higher EPA is on average going to win a very, very high percent of their games. It's a very descriptive metric in that sense. And then success rate is a little bit more predictive from a standpoint where you, again, like are removing some of the noise, some of the outlier events that could happen, and just looking at a team from like a play-by-play basis. And you can kind of feel good about making game level predictions on that end. And another thing, I like to look at on this list is their pass rate over expected. I think, Eric Bieniemy coming into the Commanders this year has had a very high pass rate in general across the league, but the Commanders have been losing more than like a team like the Chiefs or the Bengals when they had Joe Burrow. So you want to look at their pass rate relative to what we usually see from the situations that the teams are in when it comes to down distance, score differential, and different game situation metrics like that.
Can you say a word or two about total EPA as opposed to like EPA per play?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when it comes to evaluating like a holistic quarterback performance, there is signal and volume. And I think that when a team has their quarterback involved on more plays, it shows that, one, the trust that they have in that specific quarterback, but also some signal in what their game plan was. There's some games where you're playing a bad run defense and you want to just keep handing the ball off, and there's no problem with that as long as it's successful. But then there's other plays where you really have to put your quarterback, the ball in the quarterback's hands, and you kind of have to have them play hero ball. So that's where total EPA comes in from a quarterback perspective. Is not only are you getting the direction of positive or negative here, like Sam Howell has negative 9.6, Dak Prescott has positive 19.3. So we know above average or below average performance from the sign, but then we also know how much above average was it. Dak Prescott was plus 19.3. That's a very high number when it comes to adding points to your team. So you can get a good gauge of how much he was involved in the plays, how efficient he was, and what ended up happening on those plays as well.
Is there a cap to those numbers? I'm trying to figure this out in my brain as we're going along. The number is there a bottom and a top to this thing, or no?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's really no limit that you can hit theoretically in a game for EPA.
But you can gauge it to like historic norm. So it's his EPA per play was 98th percentile, and that's kind of like one way of keeping it in context.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Like that's why I try to put a lot of this stuff in percentile, because, and like have some coloring scale, like red to green or something, because I've found that helps people understand what, a decimal number that they probably haven't seen before means in like the grand scheme of things, like you mentioned there, Colin. I
just love the work you guys are doing at Sumersports. So yeah, I mean, can you just say like what was the process like, as a business now trying to inform fans?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. So when we were brainstorming over the summer of things we wanted to do to have some outreach to fans, have people get familiar with Sumersports just being a startup that was only started just over a year ago now. One of the things that we thought of was having a twice a week article, one on Mondays reviewing some of the big games from the weekend, and then one on Fridays previewing games from the weekend. And we were thinking about how we wanted to go about this article, and we settled on having game preview graphics, because like my coworker Parker Fleming does those for college football, where he'll have game preview graphics for all the big college football games every week. And so we thought we could have similar ones for the NFL. So we went through and we decided on which stats we want to include. Wanted to have stats that we thought were going to be descriptive to a lot of people and teach them a lot about the game they just saw, but also stats that they recognize. So that's why you have, advanced metrics like EPA on there, but you also have stats that people have seen before, like yards per play. So we tried to include both of those on the graphic and ended up, coding it up and putting together for these articles, and which ended up going on Twitter as well with the graphics.
Yeah, super helpful. It's really enhanced my fandom, enjoyment of the game. Talking about the introduction of expected points, and we know that came from Virgil Carter and Robert Makel in this paper from 1970. It's just a really cool story. He was a Cincinnati Bengals quarterback at the time. He had a weak arm, but he had a history of learning economics at Northwestern, ended up creating this paper, Expected Points. So, can you talk a little bit about like what the big points that you fall back to from this paper by Virgil Carter?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, first of all, this is crazy that, like you mentioned, a player currently in the NFL, a backup quarterback, very prominent position, was doing this type of work while he was in the league. Like, I mean, the equivalent now, like if Jacoby Brissett was, putting out like computer vision software to analyze games, like that would be the equivalent of what was happening now when they were doing this in 1970. So like, this is really impressive, from Virgil Carter and Robert Mackler. So when, they were thinking about this paper, it kind of goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, where they were realizing that these yards weren't being treated equally, and you had to have some type of other way to evaluate teams that were maybe boosting their yards because they were getting these empty yards on like 3rd and long and different things like that. So when they really went through and they analyzed it, like it was very probabilistic with the way that they thought about things. Like very early in the paper, they mentioned that there is not a guarantee that you make an extra point. So you can't assign 7 points to every touchdown. You should assign 6.98. And like, I think it's different things like that, where you're thinking about things from a probability standpoint instead of just a yes or no. And I think that really fueled a lot of their thinking when it went into this paper, which is really cool to see it play out.
What we're talking about 1970 here. Why do you think it has taken so long before? Not that it's caught on for a while, but I feel like we're hearing it and it's being used so much more, even just in the last 5 years. I mean, 70 years ago is a long time, right?
Yeah, I mean, that is something really interesting to bring up. And I think that football has such a culture around it where these coaches and, very respectfully so, have their ways of going about things, because you often see it be involved with it's a family coaching tree like the Shanahans, or it's, you're involved in football your whole life. You were playing Pee-wee up until, college, up until coaching in the NFL. And it's different stuff like that, where these people have their methods and they're so ingrained with how they are. And it really took other sports to kind of spur this analytics development. In football, you had to have baseball go through their Moneyball revolution and have a book and a movie made about it. And you had to have basketball and what Josh Harris was doing with the 76ers, and, what other teams were doing with the mid-range theory and shooting less mid-range shots because they were less efficient. And now you're starting to see football have their own version of that, where they look at baseball, they look at basketball, and they see how it was successful to an extent in both of those sports and what they can do from this perspective of, increasing the awareness of these advanced metrics in the sport.
Even though it was started in the 70s by a quarterback, do you think we'd have gotten here if it wasn't for baseball and Moneyball?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that played the biggest role of, getting to where we are now. Like, obviously, there's a lot of factors, like you mentioned, but I think Moneyball in being so successful in baseball is something that we are able to reference all the time when we're doing our analytics work and showing how it worked for the Oakland Athletics and ended up working for other teams. Most recently, like the Dodgers and the Tampa Bay Rays now, where it's like you're able to use these numbers to fuel a lot of your decision making.
And so this is the 1970. If you're before you're 20, then the next team that's most likely to score is the other team. And if you're down very close to the goal line, then you might want to be considering going for it, because even if you don't get it, then you're still likely to be the next team to score. Is that kind of fair?
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So right where it crosses 0, which is usually, around your own 15, like you mentioned, and that's only decreasing as offenses continue to get better. But it would be the other team's more likely to have the next score than you are.
Okay, so this was only for 1st and 10s. I wanted to cite, Robbie Greer has done great work on his NFELO website. And here he has an expected points model that shows it for all 4 downs. Is there a name for this type of technique where you're using, these batches, these groups, buckets of outcomes? Is it linear regression?
So there's a couple different terms for this. So the complicated term would be it's multinomial regression. So what multinomial regression means is you have multiple, which is where the multi comes from, buckets, like you mentioned. And so you have your touchdown bucket, your field goal bucket, your safety bucket, and you're just seeing what the probability is of each of those outcomes occurring. So when you're at, the -1, like you're 99 yards away from the goal line, you're at your own goal line, there's a higher chance of you getting a safety than if you were at the 50-yard line, if you're at midfield. And so then you take the -2 points of the safety that would be given to the other team, and you would multiply that by the probability of the safety. And then you do that for each outcome. You do that for field goal, you do that for touchdown. And you're basically saying, what's the % chance that this drive finishes in each type of outcome? So that's where multinomial regression comes from.
As Washington fans, we always look at the Eagles and, of course they're doing the tush push. And, it seems EPA model is saying that the most valuable yards are like that last one. It's 4th and 1, like no matter where you are on the field, but that 1 yard at 4th and 1 is like much more valuable than, that 1 yard you get on 1st and 10. Here you have this tush push, which is like designed to get those plays. To some degree, the EPA model kind of like explain the use, like the importance of something tush push?
So I mean that's something really interesting to also bring up. And like I think what is kind of being talked about amongst like analytics people right now is the Eagles kind of have to have their own version of an expected points model when they self-evaluate, because for them, it's a very, very high likelihood that they end up converting that 4th and 1 tush push, like you mentioned, where for other teams, it's a lower chance of converting that 4th and 1. So other teams can kind of go with the status quo, and this data is all trained in the entire league. But when you're looking at the Eagles specifically, when they're on 3rd and 1, they shouldn't be doing the tush push. They should be instead trying to do maybe a deeper pass or trying to get an explosive out of that play, because they know that there's such a high chance that they convert on that 4th and 1. Other teams don't have that luxury. They don't have that advantage. So there's kind of that fluctuation where you need to think about these things. If you're someone who works with the Eagles, and or Virgil Carter maybe, where with the situation he was in with the team he was on, and now you think about like what Brian Johnson is doing from an Eagles offensive coordinator standpoint, and he has to think about that. Like you have to think about what the whole league does, and then what your team can specifically do on top of that.
I wanted to just pull out on that thread just a little bit more of the West Coast offense, because that was created at the same time, as Bill Walsh would say, with like Virgil Carter's arm in mind. The story there was they had a strong-armed quarterback who went down in preseason, and Virgil Carter had to go in, and he had a weak arm, and it was all Bill Walsh could do was to say, hey, we have to do short passes. So like I think it's like really cool how like, you know, Virgil Carter was a part of that story, but I think it's also very interesting that like here is this guy who knew you know, the importance of getting first downs. You know, here's this quote from Bill Walsh saying, "It really isn't a complicated philosophy. We try to control the ball and build up a number of first downs. If we can get 25 or 30 first downs, it generally means the defense has time to regroup. It's a systematic ball control style of offense." So he's like talking about it in the way like old school style, like ball possession and things like that. But he's talking about first downs. Is that a common thread, you know, that you would take away from EPA as well?
Yeah, exactly. I think you nailed explaining that there. Like, I think when you look at, you know, the different ways to arrive to this conclusion, whether you're using EPA or, you know, this first downs here or some type of other, you know, method or analysis tool that you're using to drive to it, it really does come down to maximizing your efficiency on a play-by-play basis. And I think that's what Bill Walsh is explaining here, where there's only a finite number of plays you can have in a game. So he's basically saying that they want to get to that 25 or 30 first down mark divided by the number of plays, which is like X amount of first downs per play. That's also kind of what EPA is doing, where it's saying this is the amount of points that you're adding to your scoring chances per play. So I think when you look at all that stuff together, it really comes down to the efficiency aspect of things and just finding different ways to get to that level when you're evaluating your own team and evaluating the opponents that you're playing.
So, you know, and here we are, flash forward to today. You know, EPA is still important, as you said before. You know, it's very descriptive and important. And so I put up this tweet by Kevin Cole saying, since 2010, every QB has ranked first in EPA per play other than Cam Newton's.
You know, it's not like the voters are looking at EPA per play, you know, the majority of them when they end up deciding their vote. I think it just kind of shows, like you mentioned, like the descriptiveness of we're arriving at the same conclusion with different methods, whether it's, you know, you're looking at just a quarterback's whole performance in the season, how much they won, you know, like in Cam Newton's case in 2015, where they went 15-1 and he won MVP because of that. Like, we're just arriving at those conclusions differently, but like, it's good to know that it's validated in the eyes of the voters when you look at how the QB MVP has won every single year in 2010, except one, you know, when it comes to winning that award.
That's a really good point. I want to switch now to app that I made through one of your videos of Michigan football analytics. This was just yesterday. And I said, you've done so much work on teaching people how to use R and Python and do analytics for themselves. I did just do one, and it was so much fun. And, you know, it really wasn't as hard as I thought it was going to be. So I just wanted to take this time to, thank you and recommend that if somebody is just interested in learning more about this, like, they can totally do that. Here we are with this cool graph, and it tells us about EPA, and I think it ties into the discussion well. So on the bottom, we have EPA per pass, and the y-axis, we have EPA per rush. So I'm curious, like, what you take away from this graph?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's awesome that you made this graph. I'm looking forward to the many more that I'm sure that you're going to make. But, I think like what's really cool about this graph is you added the average lines as dotted lines across the middle of the graph. So you can see the mesh point for what an average balanced offense looks like, which appears to be the Saints. They are right about on the origin. And then you can look at teams that are better relative to the league when it comes to rushing than passing, like in the upper left quadrant where the Bears and the Cardinals and teams like that are. And then teams in the bottom right that are better at passing than rushing relative to the league, like the Texans or the Chargers. And then you can look at the other quadrants as well, like upper right, where it's the offenses that are both good at both things, and then bottom left is offenses that are bad at both rushing and passing. So like, I think that's what's like a main takeaway for me from the graph is like, yeah, like quarterbacks like CJ Stroud and Justin Herbert and Jordan Love have to mean more to their offense because of the lack of the rushing attack than someone like Jared Goff or Jalen Hurts, or I guess he contributes somewhat to the run game himself. But I think that's why it's a cool graph.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there's a bunch of teams up in that top right quadrant that I think myself and others would probably lean into them using more explosive plays. And I think we find that they're still the teams that end up running the ball the most. And I think that's an interesting parallel that I suppose they're using that to get to those explosive plays, which brings up the EPA on those.
Exactly. Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Hey, so changing it up here to talk about community. One podcast I recommend is called Community Experience, and they made a point that is relevant to these discussions about community. Coming together over shared interests like football is great for creating community. It's important to share information too, personal information, like how your day is going or other problems that you are facing. That's the part that lends to feeling of belonging and fights feelings of isolation and loneliness that has been described as an epidemic by the U.S. Surgeon General. So here's my story. Just after we started this project about a month ago, my darling cat had a stroke in the middle of the night, and we had to put her down. So I was devastated for a couple days, and we got her as a kitten during COVID about 3 years ago, and I really kind of loved her like a child. And when she passed, I had to kind of cope with it, and I started leaning into Joseph Campbell. He's an historian on mythology and religion. So one thing he said that I found meaningful was to follow his bliss. And this helped him reveal, his full existence and full consciousness, which he thought was really difficult. But, following, true bliss was possible. And this was based off of the Sanskrit teaching in Hinduism as well of Satchitananda. So, first, thank you for your kind words during that time. You offered to talk, and that meant a lot to me. So I want to say thank you for that. But on that note, would you mind sharing with us an example of when you chose to follow your bliss?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for sharing that story as well on here. And I think when you mention all of the community aspects of football, I think that's really important. And I see that a lot in my own life, where the biggest moment for me was when I was deciding between what path I wanted to go down when I graduated college, whether I wanted to work corporate and do football analytics on the side as a hobby, or if I wanted to actually work in football and, take maybe a bit more of a risk working in like an industry that, isn't as big as like a corporate consulting role. So, I ended up following my bliss, where I chose the football role, and I'm very happy for it because it allows me to do stuff like what we're doing right now, and allows me to work on cool projects that I'm interested in, and with people that I am really close with. But it was something that I debated for a while, but ended up deciding on this path of things, and ended up being pretty happy with my decision.
Can you tell us an example of where analytics and this community has, offered or created a relationship for you, a friendship?
Yeah, I mean, between us two here, I think that's a really good example. But to give some people, another friendship with my friend Arjun Menon, who's also going to do an episode of this. We were in school together during COVID, and because we were interested in the same things, we were going to the same Zoom meetings relating to sports and analytics. And, he ended up emailing me, just saying I thought one of your questions was really interesting. We should get in touch. And, my entire sophomore year, which was his freshman year, we ended up just going through and working on different projects together and talking football on the phone. And we never even met in person, but it was just because of this community that was set up for us before, while COVID was happening, before we were able to go in person to stuff. And then after that, we, were able to meet up and work on a bunch of stuff together, go on different trips relating to football and not football. So it was really cool to like have someone from the football analytics community end up becoming one of my closest friends, in both aspects of life.
Oh, that's awesome. I really appreciate you sharing that. And do you think other people in the Michigan Football Analytics Society would share that story as well? Similar experience?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely think so. Like, I think being a part of the Michigan Football Analytics Society, when I joined as a freshman, it was only the second year of the club. And there were like 5 to 10 people that would come to meetings. And, we ended up becoming really close because we would spend at least an hour together every week. But outside of that as well, we were getting together. And then after that, it was more of, you have like 20 to 30 people coming to meetings my senior year of college. And you could see like different friendships start to pop up of people that might have not known each other if it wasn't for that club. And like, you would see them hanging out separately outside of the club meetings and different stuff like that. So that was always really nice to see.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing this. I mean, this is something that's really important to me, and I'm hoping that we can share that with the viewers and Commanders fans and all fans of football, to reach out to us. Hopefully we can make friends and sharing this experience. I really appreciate your friendship, Tej. And, thank you so much for, helping me learn about analytics and, making me feel welcome in this community. I'm looking forward to our next episode with Ben Alomar, who's going to be teaching us about QBR and that book he wrote. He's a PhD in economics, followed by Arjun Menon in the third episode to talk about success rates, community tropes from PFF, to talk about the intersection of grading. Super excited for that. And then Brad Spielberger to talk about salary and Loser's Curse in episode 5, followed by Eric Eager in episode 6 to talk about data storytelling and PFF war. So thank you so much again, and we'll close it there. Bye.
Thank you for having me.